Welcome to Season 5 of She Ventures. I am your host, Doria Lavanino. She Ventures is a podcast about women and their work and life pivots. I believe in the power of storytelling. I also believe that if you change one woman's life, you start to change a family or a community. Our mission is to elevate the diverse stories of everyday women in their work. One promise, no mansplaining ever. Sit back, listen, and hit subscribe. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us at sheventurespodcast.com. This woman was early to podcasting, being in radio starting about a decade ago, and has consistently produced award-winning content focused on pop culture, music, entertainment, and the LGBTQ plus community in every medium. She's hosted 2 morning shows in Melbourne, Australia, before podcasting was mainstream, where she interviewed people like Paula Abdul and Martina Navratilova. She has been a TV presenter and live reporter for Bent TV. She is the writer, producer, and host of a weekly podcast called The Ginni Show. The list goes on and on with this long, amazing resume. She did turn to entrepreneurship several times, and today she is the founder and CEO of Ginni Media, a podcast strategy, creation, and production company. Ginni Saraswati, welcome to She Ventures.
Thank you, Doria. What a resume. I'm going to clip that audio clip that you have there. When people are like, can you send me a bio? I'm like, here is it read out for you in a very lovely American accent. So thank you for having me on She Ventures.
You're welcome. You're already making me laugh. So I love your levity. I think that, there needs to be more of that in the world. And that's not to say that you don't take social issues seriously, because you do. I wanted to start with a little bit about your backstory, your story of origin. Your family's from Sri Lanka, and you moved to Australia when you were 2. So I was just wondering what that experience was like, kind of going to school, new environment. That was probably a few years later, but if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. It's interesting when I'm asked this question, because typically I kind of gloss over. I'm like, born in Sri Lanka, raised in Australia. My mother was overprotective, kind of expected me to be like a doctor, lawyer, or engineer. But now it's really lovely to actually, have some time to reflect. Okay, what was that transition like? So if I am to slow down, like in Sri Lanka, I mean, from what I only have like very faded memories because I was so young, but I do remember this vivid image of just being lots of sand, lots of trees. And I remember like one of our uncles or neighbors, I'm still quite unsure of the relationship we had with him, but he just climbed this coconut tree and he just he shook it so hard and coconuts fell. And I'm like, this is really cool. And, as a 2-year-old, I'm like, wow, this is like the best thing. And then, my mother used to scare me with butterflies when I didn't eat, my dinner. So I had this fear of butterflies till I was 12. That's a separate story. But when we moved to Australia, I remember being completely bewildered and confused because my mum gave me lots of toys and food on the plane, which kind of, eased me into a bit of a sleep. So I didn't really know what was going on. But then we landed in this strange land, which was cold. People looked different.
Totally different.
Totally different. And even my auntie, who was, she put us up for a couple of nights until we moved into our unit. She was wearing these green overalls and a black t-shirt. And I just remember this just looks weird. Like people don't dress the same here. The climate is different. This house looks very different. My auntie had this 2-story lovely house, but it looked different. And I was mad that I drew on a wall. I was like, you know what? I don't like this. But the transition was, I think it was an adjustment. And I think, upon reflection, when you are growing up in an environment that looks different to what you're used to, people sound different. And even though I have an Australian accent now, people are like, oh, but when I'm on the phone, it does switch back to the Sri Lankan accent. But I guess for me, I was very fortunate to be able to, be on a path of education, have the facilities, have the opportunities that I did in Australia, which I probably wouldn't have had in Sri Lanka at the time. There was a civil war going on there. So I'm eternally grateful for that. But there was a part of me that I think this was very much driven from my mum. She was very much about keeping our culture in the family. So she had a rule: you speak Sinhalese at home and you can speak English outside of it. So she did really make an effort to keep that going. So I think, it's always kind of a juggling act of like, okay, today I'm going to play Sri Lankan and tomorrow I'm going to go back to my, Australian friends. So that was kind of my experience in a nutshell, Doria.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm trying to imagine being a little girl, you as a little girl going to school in Australia for the first time. At that point, was your English strong enough?
Well, it took me a while to speak. I remember when I went to like pre-K, which we call like kindergarten in Australia, even though kindergarten's different here. When I went to preschool and kindergarten, I was very shy because, again, I was like trying to adjust into this world where people look different and there were different cultures, and there weren't that many people who looked like me at the time. So, I used to get asked, why are you brown? And I didn't understand the question. So, Beyonce wasn't around then. I couldn't say I woke up like this.
Well,
exactly. So, I think for me, going to school, it was very much like I had to be taught certain things. Like, I didn't know this, and maybe my mum told me, but I wasn't paying attention. But my middle name was taken, which is Virginia, which is where Ginny comes from. And at home, I was called Tarushi. So when I went to school and people were calling me Virginia, I was like, I wasn't responding because that's not what I'm used to being called. Right, exactly. So I was taught what my middle name was very quickly. And I think the adjustment, it just took a while for me to kind of find my voice, which is why I'm so passionate now about what I do. I think that's the link. But being able to talk and communicate and understand that people communicate differently and they receive communication differently and they hear things differently, I think I've been always sensitive to that. And that was what my experiences really carved out for me.
That makes so much sense. And if you were to say, like, 3 things that you like about Australia. I don't know why I always say 3. I mean, you could do 2, you can do 4. I don't care. And 3 things that you really don't like that much. Like, what would that be?
3 things that I really like about Australia. I love my friends in Australia. They live there. I grew up with a very lovely group of friends who are supportive. They're my tribe, to sound cheesy. The second thing I love about Australia, it's coffee and cafe culture. Now, that may sound like a cheesy thing to say, but there is bloody good coffee in Australia.
I wouldn't have thought that.
Exactly. So if you go to Melbourne, where I'm from, the coffee there is exceptional. And what I like about that is it's the encouragement of community and gathering. So, here, when I moved to America, I quickly learned how many cafes had Wi-Fi and how many people would work there. But very much my experience of Australian culture, Melbourne culture, is when we go out to brunch, we go out to brunch to talk to our friends, to catch up.
Yes.
It's an experience and a focus of conversation rather than let's grab a coffee and do some work. Like, it wasn't as blaringly obvious in Melbourne. And the third thing I love about Australia is Melbourne, especially where I'm from. I'll say Melbourne is what I love too. It's the diverse culture. There's over like 250 cultures there in Melbourne. So where I grew up in Clayton.
I had no idea.
Yeah, it's like Queens, really. That's why I think I love Queens so much here in New York. It fits in perfectly for me and what I grew up around. But Clayton, where I grew up, there's like, funnily enough, there was a whole street of Sri Lankan shops. Back in the early, 90s, there was only one, but now there's about 5 or 6 where you can get Sri Lankan groceries. There's like a little Korea, a little place where you can go get Asian groceries and, Greek. It's just such diverse food. It sounds a lot like Queens. So that's the other thing I love about Australia, the diversity that is in Melbourne that I've experienced growing up, and the communities there that, you get to really embrace yourself. You get to really embrace the culture, should I say, not yourself.
Whatever works.
Whatever works, right, exactly.
Do you want to touch upon some of the things that you don't care about? Care for, I guess.
Okay. I didn't realize this until I moved to America. And I know every country has its own varying degrees of racial tensions or racial intolerances. But I didn't realize how intolerant Australia was in terms of the race topic, or just in terms of what they know and then what they don't understand. So that part of Australia, I mean, I was very lucky not to be victim to that often. Like, I have not experienced that. But when I came here and then I saw some of the stories coming out and I was a little bit more sensitive to the topic and I was learning a few things, I was like, hang on, that's not cool. And you asking, well, why is it offensive? I'm like, that's not really the way to go about. I mean, good to be curious, but instead of learn about why that, again, it comes down to communication. Right? So that's one thing. The second thing is it's so bloody far away, Doria. Like, it takes like a whole day to get there and a whole day to get back. So if you're going to go there, stay a while because, it takes just as long to get there. It's the other thing.
That's the one continent I'm trying to think. Antarctica. Those are the two. Right. I haven't made it to. And part of it is, it's just like, I feel like I need 3 weeks if I'm going to, at least, to do Australia.
Exactly. You do need 3 weeks. It's that bloody big. The other part I don't like is the really hot, dry summers. Because, bushfire season happens. Like, also, it gets to over 100. I'm still trying to figure out Celsius to Fahrenheit, but it gets over 108 degrees consistently in summer. So,
oh my goodness,
that part I don't miss.
Thank you. I have learned so much that I did not know.
There you go.
So you were on radio. How did that happen? Because that's not easy to get a radio gig. I mean, I don't think.
I was very fortunate in that sense where I was in college. I was studying creative arts. So you study film, you study theatre. And I'm like, okay, this is cool. I'm loving the theatre, performing arts. I love learning about cinema and all that sort of stuff. But I'm like, okay, well, you're in a good age to try things because, when you're in college and in your 20s, it's a good decade to try things and see what sticks. So I came across, and this is I was 18, I came out, and there was a station called Joy 94.9, which is Australia's first and only gay and lesbian radio station. So I was like, okay, this is a good way to kind of build community, meet new people, because, being Sri Lankan and homosexuality being illegal, it wasn't exactly I could go to a tea party at my auntie's and be like, let's talk about being a lesbian. How do you feel about that? Couldn't do that, Doria. So I applied for Joy 94.9 had a radio course where they were training, young people under 25 to pretty much learn about radio and broadcasting. So I signed up for it. They accepted me and they were only taking I think 20 people. And, I met a lot of really cool people, a lot of talented people who have gone on to do pretty amazing things as well. And I also got the opportunity to, learn about radio and host my own show. Like I started with the Graveyard Shift. Yeah, 11 p.m., a show called I Spy, the hottest hits of now, where I, do a countdown show trying to be Ryan Seacrest, because that's all we had as an example right at the time.
I'm so sorry.
So, I was doing a countdown show, and then from there I started doing, morning shows and drive time shows, and I had a lot of fun. I really enjoyed being behind the mic. I didn't think I would like it because, with theatre, you get to hide behind a character. You get to play a character. You know what to say. Your lines are set and you can play off that. But radio, you have to be yourself. And it's such an intimate platform where if you are sounding fake, it comes across 10 times louder because it's audio only, right? So that really got my feet wet. Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, I was going to say, also, you would assume that celebrities would be the most interesting to interview, but not necessarily, right? Because... I mean, some of them don't have a lot of depth. I don't know.
Well, I was lucky. The celebrities I got to interview, I actually wanted to. There was a series we did for the cast members of Queer as Folk. It was a very, very popular show in the early 2000s for the LGBT community. I think it was the only show at the time that really depicted a 3D life of what a LGBTIQ person lived, right? Because typically we had shows like Queer Eye, but you only saw this one side of, how gay men were portrayed at the time. So that was a show that meant a lot to me. So when you went in interested, and I think naturally, it was just interest. That show had such a big impact on me. I think there was a two-way thing. But yes, there were some interviews that I did that it was I either got press release answers or to steer it back to where I wanted to go was quite a workout.
Exactly. It's a media training where they've been told to make these 3 points, and no matter what question you ask, they always go right back to it somehow. It's amazing, actually.
Exactly.
It's just damn.
Yeah, and I think obviously they're doing back-to-back interviews, so I have that perspective. But what I'm grateful for about that experience is now when I do interviews with just people who love to go on tangents, and when I do this for clients, I'm I've got to steer them back. It really does get your journalist muscle working.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up your coming out. And how was it with your family?
Right. So it's interesting because in 2 weeks, I'm actually going to Australia. My cousin Shanali is getting married. It's the first time I've actually taken my partner. So my partner Aaliyah is coming with me to Australia. And it's the first time I'm going to introduce a partner to my extended family. So, I mean, it's a great time to do it because it's a wedding. You know, there's alcohol. So if people want to forget, I may have to do this again.
Social lubrication.
Yeah, social. And people I may have to also consider the fact that I may have to go through this again because people may not remember what just transpired. Like, so who's Aaliyah again? Like, wow, we have to go through this whole thing. So my family, I think, you know, this is when you're the OG and the original gay of the family, right? There's no other OG in that sense of my family. So when I came out, I think, you know, there were preconceived ideas about what gay people were like, what lesbians were like, how they behaved. And I guess that is, for me, that was kind of hard to navigate because you kind of look at yourself in such scrutiny when you're coming out, right? Because it's obviously in my culture, again, in Sri Lanka, you're thrown into jail for 20 years if you are gay. So and our culture is very heavily built on tradition of heterosexual marriage. So it's something that, you know, I also can see holistically, like it would be very hard for people who've grown up in that environment, in that country with that set of culture and traditions around to really understand. But I think for me, the positive thing was I had places like Joy, I had places like Bent TV where I had community and I had a really supportive social circle as well. And if I didn't have those two things, I think I probably would still be a closeted woman living in New York. Maybe not in New York, maybe in some part of Melbourne hidden away. I don't know what my fate would have been like, but it just goes to show the power of community and how important it is to feel like you are seen, heard, and belong.
That you belong. It's so true. And I feel like Gen Z, I have two Gen Z daughters, and I'm schooled every day about how I speak, and I'm grateful for it sometimes, not always. Yeah. Like sometimes I'm like, come on, like really? But one of the things my daughter has brought up, and it's very true, we live in a very heteronormative society where there are just certain assumptions that we internally make that are based on gender, which is the societal construct. And, you know, when I start to go down that road, I'm just like, yeah, I mean, I get it.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not something I think that, you know, some people intentionally do. It's just, again, you've grown up around certain language, so you adopt that language until you are shown or taught or experience
something
otherwise,
else.
Right? Exactly. Yes. And I think, and to your point too, like going back to your question about my family. So my extended family found out via Bent TV. And this is something I really want to unpack, Doria, because my aunt and uncle, Bent TV is on a channel called Channel 31 in Melbourne, right? So a lot of Sri Lankans watch that. A lot of different communities watch that. The gay community, Sri Lankan community, you know, the Indian community. It's like that community TV station, right? So Bent TV was on 10 p.m. Monday nights. And for some reason, my uncle's wife was watching it. And she saw me. And apparently what she heard me say, which I didn't say, is that my name is Ginni and I'm a lesbian. So that started this whole grapevine. Like she told my uncle like, what's going on? Then my other auntie was called and the other auntie was, so it went through the whole Sri Lankan grapevine. But this is the thing, right? So that's how people found out. And for me, I remember like a family member said to me, look, you know, I got a call from this auntie who said that you might get some calls about Ginni's sexuality. And, you know, my family member at the time kind of played dumb, like, oh, I don't know. I'm like, of course she knew. But she did say to me, she's like, you know, and I do believe it was from a place of, I'm scared for you of how you'll be judged. She's like, I don't mind you being this way. That I don't have a problem with that, but I don't want you to be that way in public. And I don't want you to, and you also have to understand we live here too. So, I mean, now when I look back at that, I'm like, okay, there probably was a more appropriate way to respond. But it's that progress, right? You start off somewhere and you get to another point, and that family member since has been a lot more open and you know, a bit more, the language is a little bit more like kinder, let's just say, to me. Yeah, but I think in time for me, that was a moment where you talk about pivots, Doria, I could have gone right back in the closet. And it was hard. I remember it was just before I was going to film something at Bent TV. And again, like I was crying on the way there and I'm like, wow, like I'm going to do this. Could this be my last thing, like my last gig on Bent TV or my last thing I ever do publicly about being an out lesbian or being an out lesbian? And I remember I had an interview with this group. They were like performing something at a carnival in Melbourne. And at the end, one of the singers said, hey, you're a really good interviewer. I really loved this show. It's been one of my favorites. And I think for me, that was a sign to be like, well, there's no turning back now. Like I just got to keep going. it was just that encouragement that I needed. And again, it's the community, right?
It's community that raises you up. It is so true. To go back to one thing you said, though, you said that she heard you say, I'm Ginni and I'm a lesbian, but you didn't say it?
I didn't say it. I don't think I've ever felt the need to publicly declare that. I talked a lot, like, before I mentioned
it sounds like an AA meeting. Sorry.
Exactly, right? Like, I'm just standing up and then I'm talking about, the hidden Lottle or Cherry magazine I have under my, covers, or what they have now, Bound or whatever it is. That's what she heard. And it was interesting because I watched that interview and I'm like, I didn't say that. So it's interesting that she heard it. But this is what I want to find out, Doria. What was she doing watching gay TV on a Monday night?
There's the question.
She kind of dodged a bullet there, right? So we'll unpack that at Shonali's wedding.
Yes, exactly. Get ready, Auntie, because that is coming like a torpedo for you.
Exactly.
So you've been a host on so many mediums, right? You've done radio, you've done podcasting, television. Is there a medium that you like best?
I love podcasting. I love audio media. And obviously, I think radio is the grandfather, grandmother, non-gender specific parent or ancestor of podcasting. I think the intimacy and the autonomy it gives both sides of the space. So the host is able to talk about anything, right? You can talk about how much you love Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and there'll be people who listen, right? I mean, I love the New York Knicks. I could do a whole podcast on just the comments the Knicks fans leave after a game, right? That's something, and people will listen to that, right?
I think you should. I think that would do really well, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Kicks for Knicks or something like that. But like, that aside, and I think the other part of it is for the listener, it gives the listener full autonomy. And I think, when TV started doing TiVo and on-demand TV, like when you could watch TV shows whenever you wanted to, rather than the network saying, hey, Monday 7:30, you got to watch Full House, otherwise you got to wait for the VHS special. But I think when podcasting came, it was the same. It was radio on demand, and I think it gave the listener full autonomy. And what I think is different from TV that radio or audio wasn't used to was it just opened up a whole world of more audiences, because when you're on FM radio, you're in a certain geography, right? There's only like a certain amount of people that you can reach. But if people love Paula Abdul, or if they love some of the cast from Queer as Folk, you pop it on iTunes. At the time it was iTunes. It just opens up a whole world, and the global LGBT community can access those interviews. So that's what I found with podcasting. That's why I love it so much.
And one of the things that I was looking up that kind of bothered me, and I've heard this before, but I didn't quite understand how bad it was, at least based on this statistic, 33% of listeners are female. And when Quartz analyzed 360 individual podcasts with 480 hosts, 33.3% presented as women. So that means only a third of podcast hosts are women.
Mm-hmm.
That bothers me. What's up with the gender imbalance? Why do you think it exists?
This is interesting because, the saying, like, how you do one thing is how you do everything. And I don't think that's always true in all circumstances. But you look at, just in general in workplaces, the gender imbalance, the pay imbalance. Like, I'm not surprised that's translated into podcasting or content creation, because I think the way women are judged by the way that they look and the way that they sound and the way that they present themselves is far more critical still than how men are. And then to have the community, to have the, excuse the French, to have the balls or the spine or the backbone to keep going and combat that, not everybody can do that, or everybody may not be like, look, that's a mountain I don't want to climb. So I just think a lot more mountains and obstacles are put in front of women to get to the creation stage where they can be themselves and create freely and to have resources or the community to get there. I think that's one of the reasons. And I think the other reason is too, it's just, we're now at a stage, if you look at women in the workplace, for the first time in history, women are able to have the big three. We're able to work, have thriving careers. We're able to have a family as well, concurrently to that. And we're also able to we have access to a thriving health lifestyle, right? So we've got access to great health meaning like you can go to the gym and you have access to great resources that way. 40 years ago or 50, 60 years ago, longer than that, 80 years ago, like my grandmother couldn't apply for a credit card. Like when you think about those things.
That's so crazy. I know.
Yeah. Women are in a place now where we can do those three things, and we're still, I think, figuring out what that looks for us. So it's a point of evolution and pivoting too.
You're right. It is a pivot. And you had also kind of mentioned this, which is also true, representation. I didn't have stats on LGBTQ, but what I did find was that 11.5% could be classified as non-white. So 1 in 10. I mean,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Again, why are we not leveling the playing field? But we are. We are.
Yeah.
One conversation at a time. You are an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
you moved to the US. Let's talk about that pivot. What drew you here?
Sure. So we went from radio to in my 20s, I did lots of experimenting with different, I use that when people are like, oh, experimenting around LGBT. I'm like, no, not that kind of experimenting. But career-wise, I tried a lot of careers. I was a deli assistant, which I loved because, I was around cured meats and I'm like, ooh, I have a sandwich for lunch. Then I was a trampoline park party host, which is probably, other than the job I have now, the best job I've ever had because I get to jump on trampolines every day. I get to hang with kids, make silly jokes, be silly. It was one of the best jobs I've ever had. I constructed aerospace parts for airliner as well. So that was a different thing that I did. So on the side of all of that,
you have so many pivots. Honestly, when I was writing your intro, I was just like, I can't. I'm just going to do very high level and just hope she fills in the blanks.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. So in my 20s, I tried on a few different things. And, what was hard for me was, I also worked in corporate Australia. I had 2 jobs in commercial radio, which were more the sales ad management side. But what I noticed was the corporate side of work did not work for me. I thought that's what I was doing all the creativity in radio. I loved it. I'm like, maybe I just need to find a job in commercial radio and I'll go via the ad side and go into programming. That was what I thought because that was where the money was. But I was very heavily misguided because I knew even though in those 10 years I had different jobs, did very different things, radio and having a radio show was something I kept consistently throughout those 10 years. So, I think for me, I needed to try different things to be like, okay, well, this allows me to do this. And if I didn't have radio, I wouldn't be able to go to America and meet different people over there because I had community. So it was a juggling act for me. And the biggest pivot that I came to in my 20s was that the corporate job and the corporate lifestyle wasn't for me. Corporate, it's basically 9 to 5, but my experience of it was it's never 9 to 5. It's 7 to 7.
It's whenever they want you.
Exactly. And I think the way that it was very much like you need to be here at 8:30 and we need to have a meeting every day about what you're doing and we need to go around the table and talk about what you're doing. I'm like, so you're micromanaging me because you're incompetent to manage a whole team. Great. But there are just things I did not agree with. And again, I'm not dissing that 9 to 5 lifestyle. That works for some people.
It does.
That's great. But I knew there was another way of working which would give me more spaciousness to do what I wanted to. I wanted to go to the gym. I wanted to be healthy. I wanted to have a decent night's sleep. And I did not want to worry about this meeting where we had to discuss every time we sneezed every morning. That wasn't a way to start. And I didn't see how that improved bottom line. It was just a thing they did because they were told to. And I knew, okay, this didn't work for me. So I tried shift work, which is where the deli assistant, the party host, and the aerospace job came in. I got to do, and that was great. Yeah, so I got to clock on, clock off at a time. I got to leave work at work, and I got to do radio radio shows on the side. I got to, travel. I also got to start my own podcast when that was happening. So that eventually, and I also my first business actually failed. It failed pretty dismally. I think I lost money.
The event business?
The event business. So I had an event company called Bling, and I started it because I saw that events were hot at the time. I'm like, I'm just going to start an event company. Didn't have any experience running a business. I just thought I'd start it. I'll just model off what I see and observe. But I also noticed that every time I did it, there was something heavy. But I kept ignoring it. I'm like, just keep going. Just keep trying it. And I remember getting to the end of it. I'm like, this does not feel right. I'm going to discontinue it, and I'm just going to focus back to what I love, which is radio. But what I learned from Bling is it was like going through a business degree because I learned that if you're in it for just the money and there's no greater vision, purpose, or something that really drives you other than that, it's just a very temporary fix. There's holes I'm trying to plug in for some reason. The team I attracted wasn't aligned with what I wanted. Obviously, nothing's going to go right if that be the case. And also just my overall want of it. It was for wanting approval and wanting to please other people. I'm like, no, that's not what I want. So it was a great business degree.
I was going to say, like, you didn't have to pay for the MBA. And I feel like so many people have these starter businesses where they fail, but they learn so much from them. And that's where the best learning comes from. And also knowing things about yourself. Like, I want to, I'm a people pleaser too. And I'm trying to keep that in check all the time because it can definitely work against me in certain situations. So you went from there, as I understand it, to what you're doing today, which is so cool. So tell us about that.
Sure. So I was working at the aerospace company and, I was traveling to New York every year because the first time I came to New York was actually 12 years ago, 2011. And I remember like walking into Times Square, I'm like, wow, like this is unlike anywhere else I've ever been. So it was really, I just fell in love with the city, at the time too. So ever since 2011, I was coming back to America every year. Like I was just going to New York, just immersing myself in the creativity. I'm like, I want to live here one day. And then, I was working away at the job and, traveling here and I started to build my community here. Some of the people who I'd interview on the radio show, they lived here too. So we're friends now. They're still in my community. And then it just made sense for me to move over here because, it felt like a lot of media traction was happening here in the States that I wasn't quite seeing in Australia. New York really is the capital of podcasting. Like, the avenues here to be able to access creativity, studios, resources is just, it's not comparable to anywhere. It's incredible to anywhere else. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to move here. So I started looking at ways like what visas I could get, what I needed. So I started as a side hustle, the early stages of Ginni Media. I was editing shows. I was producing show notes. I was doing artwork and I'm like, all right, I need 5 clients to be able to afford to live in New York. So, I had 5 clients and I'm like, let's just move. I handed in my resignation at the aerospace job and 2 months later I was on a plane sold all my stuff in Australia on a plane with 3 suitcases and here I was in Brooklyn.
So that was your proof of concept, really. You did the 5 clients to see if there's an appetite for what you did and the affordability of it, and that worked out. And so you have some really impressive clients. Cynthia, I don't even know how to pronounce her name because I'm not very... Rowley? Is it Rowley? Rowley? I don't know.
Rowley. She's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, she seems very cool. Allure, Siemens, and then you have a ton of entrepreneurs as well. So it's not that you're like just doing corporate podcasts, but I'm sure that they pay well. So that's nice work to have. So how do you find, does it come to you? How does that all work?
Well, traditionally, Doria, that's a great question. Our business, I say our business, like there's me and multiple personalities running it, which is kind of true. So Ginni Media, we've grown primarily on referrals, so client referrals. I haven't done any paid advertising. I'm a little old school when it comes to scalability and customer service. I really believe that scalability or growth should not supersede quality and personability and connection because podcasting is about building community. It's about having conversations. It's about connecting. It's about listening and listening in all its forms. It's also about like creating this space where you can have conversations around your specific interests and you can listen to it whenever you want, talk about it however you want. So there is that beauty of it as well. There is also some muddiness that comes in with that freedom sometimes. Sometimes people do broadcast things that are quite dangerous, but that's another story. But that part of it, it's very important for me to walk the talk. And that's very important for me that I and my team are aligned with that as well, that we do walk the talk with connection and kindness and conversation and communication as well. So I think for me, that's been a real cornerstone of our growth. And, you've got to be patient. I mean, I know a lot of startups when they start, they're like, all right, I want to sell my startup in 3 years. I want to scale it as big as possible. And that's one way of working. Like I've said before, that works for some people. For me, I want something long-term. So it's going to take more time. I'm going to need a lot more patience. But, so far it is growing. That's the value or the destination that I'm heading towards.
Right. And it's like relationship sales, right? In a way, and I think that that's so much more valuable, the authenticity of that, than this idea of, it also just seems very like testosterone driven. Like, we're going to 10X who cares? Like, as long as you're building something and creating something that you care about and you can sustain yourself and you're getting the message out into the community and world, that's amazing.
Exactly. And I think at the end of the day too, we are actually servicing who we need to in terms of what they actually require. Because at the end of the day, your customers really do, if you treat your customers in a certain way and you treat your team in a completely different way, like, there's some synergy that's missing. There's something misaligned there. Like, if you do lead by example, and that's something that I kind of like scoffed at in my 20s. I'm like, what do you mean lead by example? We don't watch what leaders do. We do. If we're in that much proximity to them day in, day out, and if I'm like, I expect this to be done and I do the complete opposite, people aren't going to trust me. So if I'm saying, hey, you need to build community and connection and you need to be kind and you need to be patient, you've got to really live and die by your own sword in that way. So that's another part of growing a business too.
Yes, very, very much so. And there's some unpredictability to it, right? Each month you don't really necessarily know. I mean, you have I guess you're at a point probably where you have more continuity, but certainly at the beginning, right? You just don't know what's going to happen.
Exactly.
I did want to just quickly go over monetization because I think that
Sure.
is something that a lot of individual podcasters struggle with. In your opinion, what do you think is the most effective way to monetize? Is it, programmatic, reading ads? I don't know. I don't even know. Patreon is another one that I know of.
Yeah.
What do you think works?
So that's a great question, Dorian. I think it's a common question that I get. And the way that I answer it is now more than ever in terms of monetization options, like podcasting platforms like your Acast, your Megaphone, they're including programmatic as a part of your subscription, which is great. So if you are working on a podcast, there is some opportunity for you to monetize the traditional route of ads and sponsorships and reads and that sort of thing. That's one route. But I would encourage people to have a podcast. Ads is one way to get some money in. And you don't have to do much heavy lifting. Like the programmatic team on that particular hosting service will take care of linking things and adding mid-roll and pre-roll for you. So that's kind of like a low-hanging fruit there.
Are you able to control, like I wouldn't want to have, an ad for, fill in the blank, porn. I don't know.
Yeah. Of course. Like, you don't want to have an ad about, you don't want to have I think Spotify got into trouble for this a while back. Like, they had a podcast about, being sober and they played alcohol ads in it. That's
exactly
completely misaligned with the message. And it's very poor advertising control on behalf of it looks bad on behalf of the podcast, right? And they had no control over it. I do believe certain podcasting platforms, I know Acast does this too. If you do message their team and say, hey, I don't want ads of these categories put in, you can control that in that way.
Or vaping.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Whatever.
Cigarettes or anti-abortion ads, whatever it might be.
Right,
like you might be
exactly.
something like, I don't want that in there. So that and I remember at the time, my name was Ginni. They asked if I wanted stuff about Vagisil, which was, I'm like, I don't want to be the girl named Ginni talking about Vagisil, which is like this thrush cream. Can you imagine the trouble I would get into? And also they'd be like, oh, Ginni talks about thrush cream. So I'm like, no thrush or anything to do with vaginas. Yeah, that's the Vagisil, and her name's Ginni. And Ginni Media is the company that produces no. So you can speak to your hosting service about that. The other way to monetize, Doria, is, and I would encourage podcasters that look at how the podcast fits into their life or their business, right? Because sometimes podcasters do they're hobbyist podcasters. They don't necessarily have a business, but sometimes people do have a business around it. So think about how that fits into that part of your life or business, and then try to see other ways that you can monetize it. So other ways that you can monetize your podcast is your podcast can be leveraged as a press pass. So you can go to events, interview keynote speakers, build relationships, and who knows, that might turn into a sponsorship deal. Relationships aside, the other thing that people don't talk about is you can use a podcast as a way to get in front of your ideal clientele. So if I'm a podcast producer, I would pitch myself saying, hey, I have a podcast. I'd love to give a keynote speech for free. Can you have me come speak at your event? And I get in front of my ideal clientele. So even though I wasn't paid a speaking fee, I will very likely convert a client there because
so smart.
I'm speaking. So there's things that you can do that way. And the other way to monetize is think about what you can do for your audience. I think gone are the days.
You can solve,
exactly.
Right?
What problem you can solve. Because if you're a coaching business, I'm sure you get 3 frequently asked questions about, okay, how do I streamline my business, or how do I organize my morning routine or my day? What resource could you give them to be I actually trust Doria's advice, so I actually want to follow her. So you build that trust, that community, that patience, but also remember, podcasting is a long-term game. I've noticed a lot of podcasters treat it like it's Netflix. Like you just binge it and that's it. So it's a long-term game. So look at it that way too, and what that looks like financially. Yeah.
Absolutely. That makes so much sense. And the very last question before you tell us where we can find out all the amazing things that you're up to. One of the things that really stands out to me about you is you're a woman that loves to laugh, and that's unusual. I don't see that a lot. And I wondered if you had always been that way. Do you use comedy as a way to affect change?
How do I use comedy as a way to affect change?
Do you, I love that. Do you? I don't know. Like, I'm curious.
No, I appreciate that, Doria. I think for me, it was important for me because life for me was so serious up until I was like 13, 14. Like, you know, my parents got divorced when I was very young. You know, my sister got married early and all sorts of terrible things happened. My mum had bipolar. She got hospital. So a lot of things happened between my ages of 2 and 12, right? And that's your formative years. So I remember like, I felt like that spirit that was in me watching the unknown relative or relationship shake that coconut tree. I felt that spirit of me of curiosity and excitement and childlike, you know, spirit was just kind of squandered. And I remember like meeting my best friend when I was about 13 or 14, but she was just silly to the nth degree. Like the stuff she would do would just make everybody laugh, and she just did not care what people thought. And I was super, super quiet. So when I met her, I kind of, you know, learned to laugh at myself a bit and learned to laugh at, you know, what I did and not take myself so seriously. And I think, again, going back to community, when you have people around you who can foster that, like, let's just have joy, because joy does beget more joy. And I think if you can, you know, come from a place of happiness and joy, more so joy than happiness, I would say. I think they're two very different things. If you are joyful, I think the way that you look at things, the way that you look at life, like it's a lot more geared to be reflection-based rather than criticism-based. So I could look at my experience of bling and be like, well, that was shit. I lost all this money. But I look at it from, I didn't have fun. It wasn't joyful. I mean, I met some cool people at the time and that was great. But also I learnt so much. And that's because I know that I also was an idiot because I was trying to, you know, please people. And I mean, I have compassion for myself for it now, but I also like, I know that doesn't work in business. And that's why like now I have the opposite effect. And I think joy is a great teacher because it does keep pushing you forward. Because once you get joy or harmony comes along too, and you really do connect with what are the next steps, right? And it changes every day. So I think joy is a great teacher in that sense.
I love that. And that is a perfect place to end our hopefully continuing conversation. And if you could let the audience know where they can find out more about you.
Thank you so much, Doria. So they can find me, you can go to ginnimedia.com, check out our website, and you can hit me up on Instagram at Ginni Media or The Ginni Show. I do check my DMs, and my team does too, but I will be there to respond. And thank you so much for having me on She Ventures. This has been really a blast, and thank you for your insightful questions. I love them.
You've been listening to She Ventures. Like what you heard? You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe and sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a show.